So in the original Greek text of the New Testament, there is this verse, and it's probably the most famous, most heavily quoted verse used to demand a wife's absolute submission to her husband.
Oh, absolutely. The big one.
Right, the big one. But here's the wild part. It doesn't actually contain the word submit.
It doesn't.
Like, it is completely missing. It is literally a phantom verb. Yet if you look around today, I mean, you have entire modern institutions, multi-million-dollar marital counseling paradigms, massive social movements, and they are all built on the foundational bedrock of that one missing word.
It is wild.
It really is. So how does a word that isn't even there become like one of the most effective weapons for interpersonal dominance in history? Well, welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah, it really is the ultimate magic trick of textual manipulation. And it's a dynamic that has profound and just often devastating impacts on millions of lives.
For sure. And if you are listening to this right now and if you spend any time around church history or theological debates, or maybe you grew up in one of those highly structured, hierarchical communities, you already know the heavy baggage of these texts.
You feel it in your bones.
Exactly. You've seen the plaques on the walls, you've heard the sermons. But what our stack of sources highlights today, it isn't just a basic theological disagreement.
Right. It goes way deeper.
Way deeper. We are examining the actual, psychological architecture of how sacred texts which were historically designed to liberate people, mind you, are surgically altered to strip away your agency.
Yeah.
So we are looking at theological analyses, psychological frameworks, and these crazy historical case studies that map out what we might call the weaponization of divine truth.
Right. And to really set the table for this, there is a core metaphor from our research that I think perfectly captures the structural reality of what we're looking at here.
Oh, the gun metaphor.
Yeah, the loaded gun. So structurally speaking, a sacred text is basically like a loaded gun sitting on a table.
Yeah.
The text itself has absolutely no opinion on whether it is picked up by someone to defend the defenseless or, to rob them blind.
Right. It's just an inanimate object. It's just the instrument.
Exactly. It's just the instrument. And what's so fascinating and honestly terrifying about this kind of spiritual manipulation is that the abuser doesn't have to go and invent a new religion.
Right. They don't have to write a fake Bible from scratch.
No, they don't. The authority is already baked right into the pages. It simply requires surgical editing.
Surgical editing. I mean, that is just a chilling way to frame it. But I do have to push back a little bit here right at the start.
Okay, sure.
Are we saying that this is always a conscious, diabolical intent? Because, sometimes people are just, really bad at reading comprehension, right?
Yeah, for sure.
People misinterpret things all the time without actively trying to be a supervillain.
Yeah. That is a crucial distinction to make. And yes, innocent misinterpretation happens constantly. I do it, you do it.
Right.
But our sources point to a very specific, almost mechanical four-step choreography that distinguishes an innocent mistake from actual scriptural abuse.
Okay.
They call it spiritual ventriloquism.
Spiritual ventriloquism, wow.
Right, because when you look at the mechanics, it is just too precise to be an accident. So step one is isolate. The fancy theological term is proof texting.
Right, just grabbing one piece.
Exactly. You surgically remove a single verse from its surrounding paragraph, from its historical audience, and from its, cultural covenant.
Just ripping it out of its home.
Yeah. And then step two is elevate. You take that isolated fragment, completely divorced from its original reality, and you amplify it into this freestanding, absolute, timeless mandate.
So you essentially take it out of its natural ecosystem and just pump it full of steroids.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Which leads directly into step three, which is suppress.
The cover-up.
The cover-up. You deliberately hide or just ignore all the surrounding verses. Especially, and this is key, especially any clauses that place a counterbalancing obligation on the person in power.
Right. Hide the fine print.
Exactly. And finally, step four is weaponize. You take that now untethered fragment and you apply it exclusively downward, right onto the less powerful party.
One of the sources uses this great architectural analogy for this that just really stuck with me. They compare this whole process to a brick in a wall.
Oh, yeah, that's a brilliant visual.
Right. So the manipulator lifts a verse out of a paragraph the exact same way you would rip a single load-bearing brick right out of a brick wall. And then instead of using that brick to build something, they just swing it like a club.
Yeah.
And the wall they ripped it from, it obviously collapses somewhere else, usually right onto the person they are trying to control.
And seeing this directly addresses your question earlier about whether this is intentional or just, bad reading comprehension.
How so?
The fingerprint of manipulation is in its directional bias. When you look at how these isolated verses are actually deployed in real life, they overwhelmingly, almost exclusively flow downhill.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting, because you're absolutely right. Think about it. Nobody ever uses the husbands, love your wives, to launch a relentless, inquisition into a powerful, dominating husband to demand more sacrifice from him.
Never happens.
Or nobody ever uses the verse, masters, treat your slaves fairly, to launch an ethics investigation into a toxic corporate CEO.
Right.
The verses chosen for control are literally always the ones that place this unbearable burden of compliance onto the person who already has less structural power. That asymmetry alone proves it's not a misunderstanding, it is a deliberate redaction.
Exactly. When the interpretation of a sacred text consistently exempts the powerful from any meaningful sacrifice, while simultaneously demanding total unquestioning compliance from the vulnerable, well, we have to call it what it is. You are no longer doing theology. You are doing politics disguised as piety. You are just using the divine voice to underwrite your own supremacy.
Wow. Okay, let's move from this general framework directly into the trenches, because we need to look at its most intimate and, frankly, its most common application.
The home.
The domestic battlefield, yes. Let's talk about Ephesians 5.22 and Colossians 3.18. Wives, submit.
Yeah, the classic.
In controlling marriages, these verses are used like a literal spiritual choke collar. They are invoked to dictate a wife's finances, to override her bodily autonomy, to isolate her from her social circles. It effectively becomes this divine restraining order against a human being having any personal agency.
It really does.
So go back to my intro. Walk us through the missing verb. How does this actually work?
Well, it is arguably the most famous case of scriptural amputation in the entire New Testament. Let's just look at the grammatical reality of Ephesians 5.22.
Okay, let's do it.
In our English translations, it usually reads, "Wives, submit yourself to your own husbands as you do to the Lord."
Seems pretty straightforward in English.
Right, but if you unroll the original Greek manuscript, verse 22 literally doesn't have its own verb. The actual verb submit is not in the sentence.
Okay, stop right there, because I know people listening are going to be like, wait, what? If the verb isn't in the Greek, how on earth did it become the standalone bedrock for centuries of gender hierarchy?
Right.
Did translators just invent it out of thin air to keep women down?
Well, it's not that they invented it out of thin air, but they made a profound and, frankly, biased interpretive choice when chapter and verse numbers were added centuries later.
Way later, right?
Oh, yeah. Largely by folks like Stephen Langton in the 13th century and Robert Estienne in the 16th century. You have to remember, the original text was a flowing letter. It was meant to be read out loud in one sitting.
No tiny little numbers breaking it up.
Exactly. So verse 22 actually borrows its verb from the preceding sentence, which is verse 21. And verse 21 reads, "Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ."
Wait, submit to one another.
Yes. The overarching mandate of the entire passage is built around the Greek word alelotasimenoi, which literally means mutual submission.
Alelotasimenoi. So the absolute baseline expectation for every single relationship in that community is mutual yielding.
Exactly. The entire household code that follows that wives and husbands, children and parents, slaves and masters, is simply Paul elaborating on what that baseline of mutual submission looks like in various specific relationships.
Okay, so it's not a flowchart.
No. It is decidedly not a Roman hierarchy chart with the husband sitting at the apex like some miniature emperor. But by severing verse 21 from verse 22, the manipulator gets to quote the second half of a thought and just pretend the first half, the part requiring mutuality, never existed.
It totally flips the script. You literally cannot demand one-way submission using a sentence that is grammatically dependent on a command for mutual submission.
It just can't.
And then you have Colossians 3.18, which gets the exact same treatment. Wives, submit yourselves to your husbands. But what does the very next breath say? What does verse 19 actually say?
Oh, this is vital. Colossians 3.19 says, "Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them." And we really have to look at the Greek word for harsh here because it's so specific.
Okay, what is it?
The word is pikrenest. It doesn't just mean, don't yell or don't be grumpy. It carries the profound sense of a deep, creeping bitterness, a corrosive embitterment that kind of curdles the soul and inevitably manifests as cruelty or coldness.
Wow, corrosive embitterment.
Yeah. The Apostle Paul is not handing husbands a scepter and a crown here. He is handing them a severe, flashing warning label about the toxicity of unchecked power.
Yet in controlling households, verse 18 gets, laminated and stuck on the fridge as a permanent, unquestionable law, while verse 19 gets treated like the terms and conditions on a software update.
Yes.
You just scroll all the way to the bottom and hit agree without ever actually looking at it.
That is a perfect way to describe it.
But the counterweight to all this is even heavier, isn't it? If we go back to Ephesians 5, verse 25, it tells husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church. And our sources go incredibly deep into the philosophical implications of this.
They really do. And this is where the abusive framework is completely dismantled by its own theology. Because to understand the actual gravity of Ephesians 5.25, we have to look at Philippians 2.6 to 8.
Okay.
That passage outlines the foundational early Christian concept of kenosis.
Kenosis. Okay, let's really unpack that, because I feel like if we don't understand kenosis, we don't understand the magnitude of what is actually being asked here.
Yeah, kenosis comes from the Greek verb keno, which means to empty. It is this stunning, deeply subversive hymn in Philippians that describes how Christ, who was in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage.
Right.
Instead, he made himself nothing. He emptied himself, taking the very nature of a servant. He embraced maximum human vulnerability. I mean, first by entering the world as a helpless, dependent infant, and ultimately by submitting to the maximum public humiliation and agony of the Roman cross.
Just think about how insane that sounded to a first-century Roman audience.
Oh, it would have been absolute madness.
Right, because their entire worldview was based on the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, who had absolute legal power, even the power of life and death, over every single person under his roof. The gods of Rome were conquerors. They dominated. They just took whatever they wanted.
Exactly.
And here's Paul saying, oh, you want to be the head of the house? Great. Your model is a God who strips himself of all privilege, grabs a towel, washes feet, and bleeds to death for his enemies.
Precisely. When Paul tells husbands to love as Christ loved, he is invoking the entire cosmic scope of the crucifixion as the minimum acceptable bar for a husband's authority.
I love how the sources frame the irony of this. It's dark, but it cuts right to the bone. They say a controlling husband who demands Ephesians 5.22 but completely ignores 5.25 is essentially walking into a Michelin star restaurant, ordering a massive, incredibly expensive dry-aged steak, eating the whole thing, and then sending only the bill back to the kitchen.
Yes.
He wants the absolute sovereignty of God, but he completely rejects the self-emptying agony of the cross. He wants the throne, but he absolutely refuses the towel. It's absurd.
It is absurd.
You literally have a guy demanding absolute unquestioned authority in his living room, essentially cosplaying Caesar, but he's doing it while wearing a cross necklace.
And if we look at this psychologically, this selective citation is a textbook example of what clinical therapists call the cognitive offloading of moral responsibility.
Oh, that's fascinating. Break that down.
Well, doing the actual grueling internal work of self-sacrificial love is terrifying. It requires a person to sit with their own vulnerability, their own dependency, their own deep flaws. It requires them to be truly known by their partner.
And for a manipulator, that's just a non-starter.
Exactly. For a controlling individual, that level of intimacy feels like death.
Yeah.
So they use the text as an escape hatch. By externalizing all the burden onto the other person's forced obedience, they just bypass the discomfort of genuine relationship, because domination is always, always easier than sacrifice.
Wow. That makes so much sense. It's basically a defense mechanism dressed up as righteousness. But here's the terrifying part about this psychological double bind.
Yeah.
A victim might eventually recognize this abuse in the home, right? And they might try to escape by seeking refuge in their community or their church or some institution. But what happens when that exact same mechanism of grammatical amputation has already been used to build the church's leadership structure?
Right.
The refuge is actually just a larger cage. So let's look at how Hebrews 13 is weaponized in those spaces.
Yeah, the transition from domestic control to institutional cover-up is completely seamless because the underlying mechanics are identical. Let's examine Hebrews 13.17. In isolation, if you just see it printed on a church bulletin or a leadership retreat packet, It reads, "Obey your leaders and submit to their authority."
Which, out of context, just sounds like a blank check for absolute power.
Right.
I can so easily see a toxic authoritarian leader projecting that exact verse onto a giant screen right before, refusing to let the congregation see the church's financial audit,
It happens all the time.
or using it to silence a whistleblower who found out about misconduct on staff. Suddenly asking a basic, practical question of accountability is framed as literal rebellion against God.
Yes. But once again, we have a suppressed context. The verse does not stop with the period after authority. It continues with a massive qualifying clause, it says, because they keep watch over you as those who must give an account.
Give an account.
Exactly. And again, the original language is deeply illuminating here. The Greek word translated as keep watch is agrypnusin.
Agrypnusin, what does that mean?
It literally means to lie awake or to be sleepless.
Sleepless.
Yes. It is the visceral, physical language of an ancient shepherd who stays awake all night in the freezing cold, staring into the dark, listening for wolves in order to protect the vulnerable flock.
Wow.
It is not the language of a medieval monarch sitting on a velvet throne collecting taxes, and it is certainly not the language of a modern CEO pastor flying on a private jet, completely insulated from the actual struggles of the congregation.
So the verse is actually defining leadership as a state of highly vulnerable, accountable exposure.
Exactly. Spiritual authority in the New Testament framework is entirely defined by heavy responsibility and protective service. So when a leader invokes this verse to demand unquestioning obedience from a congregation, while simultaneously refusing to submit themselves to outside accountability, they are performing the exact same scriptural surgery as the abusive husband.
It's the landlord analogy from our notes. Let's stretch this out because it is so perfect for this.
Yeah, let's hear it.
It's like a predatory landlord who aggressively enforces the tenant must pay rent on the first of the month clause of the lease, right? Like he will take you to court over that clause.
Oh, absolutely.
But he entirely shreds the landlord must maintain the premises in safe and habitable condition clause. And then when the tenant points out that, hey, the roof is actively caving in and there is black mold everywhere, the landlord acts deeply offended that the tenant is violating the sanctity of the lease.
Exactly. It's so hypocritical.
But there is another verse that corrupt leaders love even more than Hebrews 13, a verse that acts like a magical diplomatic immunity shield. Touch not mine anointed.
Oh, yes. 1 Chronicles 16.22 and its parallel in Psalm 105.15, do not touch my anointed ones, do my prophets no harm.
Right.
In modern institutional cover-up culture, this has essentially become the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card. We see it deployed constantly to deflect criminal investigations, to shut down investigative journalists, or just to shame victims into silence.
Just weaponize silence.
Right. The psychological implication they are projecting is that investigating a religious leader's conduct is a cosmic spiritual assault on God himself.
But let's look at the actual historical context of that verse, because the irony of how it's used today is just staggering. Who are the anointed ones in this specific ancient text?
Right. We have to look at the narrative arc of 1 Chronicles 16. The text is historically recounting how God protected the wandering patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Okay.
These were tiny, highly vulnerable nomadic families wandering through hostile foreign territories. They had absolutely no land, no standing armies, no political power whatsoever.
They were basically refugees.
Yes. They were surrounded by incredibly powerful, heavily militarized pagan kings like Abimelech and Pharaoh who could have just wiped them out, stolen their wives, or enslaved them without a second thought. So God is issuing a divine decree of physical protection over these vulnerable, marginalized outsiders against violent, established foreign powers.
Okay, so the anointed ones were the ancient equivalent of vulnerable refugees. They weren't modern clergy with corner offices, massive salaries, and, aggressive legal teams on retainer.
Correct. It was a statement about God providing physical protection from murder and exploitation. It was absolutely never a statement about providing immunity from moral or legal scrutiny for powerful insiders holding immense structural power over others.
This role confusion is just wild to me. Just think about the sheer audacity. You have a powerful modern pastor, maybe facing a financial audit or credible allegations of abuse, and he cites this verse to dodge accountability. He is essentially standing in the shoes of Pharaoh, the guy with all the power, all the money, all the influence, and he is reading himself the lines that were explicitly written to protect vulnerable people from people exactly like Pharaoh.
It's unbelievable.
Right. It's literally the wolf reciting the shepherd's protective decree over the sheep back to the shepherd and demanding the shepherd back off. And he expects everyone in the room to just nod along reverently.
It is a profound, total inversion of the text's original intent. And Honestly, this raises a critical transition in our analysis, because Scripture isn't just weaponized to protect institutional power or domestic dominance. It has historically been used to extract massive resources.
Economics?
Yes. If you can use a heavily redacted text to control a marriage and shield an institution, you can certainly use it to enforce massive labor hierarchies and extract incredible wealth.
Yeah, we have to tackle the darkest, most catastrophic misuse of Scripture first. The economized weaponization of labor. Ephesians 6.5 and Colossians 3.22. Slaves, obey your earthly masters.
Yep.
We absolutely cannot gloss over this. This specific isolated verse was the theological infrastructure used to underwrite, justify, and sanctify the horrors of chattel slavery in the Atlantic world.
It was the bedrock of it.
And honestly, today we still see it used in softer yet deeply manipulative forms, right? Like to force religious workers or staff to accept wage theft, extreme burnout, or just brutally unsafe working conditions, all under the guise of doing it for the Lord.
It is, without question, Scripture's most catastrophic case study in decontextualized abuse. To truly understand the mechanics here, we have to grasp the extreme survival manual context of the first century Roman Empire.
Survival manual, I like that framing.
Right, because Paul was writing pastoral counsel to early Christian communities who were deeply embedded and legally trapped inside the brutal Greco-Roman legal institution of slavery. Roman law, specifically the doctrine of patria potestas, gave heads of households absolute life or death power over enslaved people.
Right, and it's not like the early Christian church, which was basically just a marginalized underground Jewish sect at the time, had any political lobbying power to abolish the imperial slave trade.
Not at all.
Open rebellion against Rome wasn't just risky, it meant mass crucifixion. I mean, we all know what happened to Spartacus.
Exactly. So the text was offering these marginalized individuals a deeply subversive way to retain their personal agency, their moral dignity, and their spiritual autonomy within a brutal system that was simply not up for a democratic vote. By reframing their labor as a service to God, rather than mere subjugation to a cruel human, it carved out an internal space of freedom that Rome literally couldn't touch. It was absolutely not an endorsement of the legal system itself.
And how do we know for a fact it wasn't an endorsement? Because of the verse that slaveholders desperately tried to hide.
The suppressed verse, Ephesians 6.9.
Yep.
After addressing the enslaved, Paul immediately turns his pen to the masters, the people holding the whip, and says, "Masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him."
Wow, no favoritism. I want us to really sit with how explosive that phrase would have been in a Roman household.
It is a radical ontological leveling of humanity. I mean, Rome's entire society was built on intense favoritism and strict violent hierarchy. Paul is claiming that the wealthy, powerful Roman master and the enslaved person with no legal rights stand as absolute equals before the ultimate judge of the universe. It quietly but completely dismantles the entire philosophical justification for the Roman hierarchy.
It pulls the rug right out from under them.
Exactly. Historical slaveholders in the American South, for instance, had to work incredibly hard to keep verse 9 out of earshot. I mean, they literally published heavily redacted slave Bibles that entirely removed these passages, because if you read verse 9, it ruins the entire theology of supremacy.
It's the exact same missing brick as the marriage verse. They take the obedience clause, they completely discard the massive counterweight of radical equality and mutual accountability, and they use the remaining fragments to build a prison.
Yes.
And we see this exact same logic of economic extraction applied to finances today, specifically with Malachi 3.0. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven.
Oh, yeah.
This verse is the absolute bread and butter of modern prosperity preachers. They treat this ancient text like a literal spiritual vending machine.
Or a casino floor.
Yeah.
The modern prosperity application strips away every single specific detail of the text. They remove the specific covenant. They remove the specific nation of Israel, the historical moment of the post-exilic period. And most importantly, they ignore the actual purpose of the funds being collected.
Right. They just erase all of that.
And they repackage it as a universal, individualized investment formula. Insert your seed money here, receive miraculous wealth there. It preys on financial desperation with the exact same emotional logic as a slot machine.
Just one more pull of the lever, one more seed offering, one more maxed out credit card donation, and the jackpot is going to hit. But let's look at the actual context of Malachi 3. What was actually going on when this was written?
It is a highly specific covenantal policy correction directed at the post-exilic nation of Israel, so around the time of Nehemiah and Ezra. The nation had returned from exile and was rebuilding, but they had stopped funding the temple system. However, more importantly than the building itself, they had stopped funding the social safety net that the temple administered.
Oh.
In the ancient Israelite economic system, the tithe was essentially a legal welfare tax designed to support the marginalized, specifically the orphans, the widows, the resident aliens, and the Levites who owned no land.
So the tithe wasn't about, enriching the high priest so he could buy a better chariot. It was literally about keeping vulnerable people from starving to death.
Precisely. In Malachi, God is severely rebuking a nation for exploiting the poor and neglecting their collective welfare. The floodgates of heaven being promised in the text referred to literal rain.
Oh, like actual weather.
Yes, agricultural abundance for a subsistence farming society, so they could actually restore that social safety net. It was a promise of communal provision, not a promise of a personal luxury vehicle for an elite religious leader.
I mean, using Malachi 3.1 as a personal wealth-building strategy for a multimillionaire preacher is like taking a city's public health ordinance, literally a tax meant to feed starving children, and marketing it as a luxury diet pill for the ultra-rich.
It's sickening, really.
It's a total cynical rebrand of the text's original purpose. So what does this all mean historically? We've talked about modern marriages, modern churches, and historical slavery. But to prove this isn't just a contemporary phenomenon born out of, televangelists and modern toxic leadership, we need to look at how Jesus himself dealt with this exact dynamic.
We do?
Because he didn't just teach theology in a vacuum. He was actively targeted by the ultimate ancient compliance officers.
You're referring to the Pharisees, and they are absolutely crucial to this deep dive because they give us the New Testament's clearest, most vivid portrait of Scripture being weaponized not just against the vulnerable, but against the innocent, against Jesus himself.
Right.
And what's fascinating and just deeply unsettling is that the Pharisees didn't misquote the law. They didn't make up fake verses.
No, they knew it perfectly.
They had the Torah meticulously memorized, but they used their precise legal accuracy in the service of absolute bad faith. They used the law as a trap.
Let's walk through the Sabbath controversies in the Gospels because they perfectly illustrate this weaponization.
Yeah.
You have this string of incidents. In Matthew 12, the disciples are plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath because they're hungry. Also in Matthew 12, Jesus heals a man with the withered hand.
Right.
Then in Luke 13, healing the crippled woman who was bent over for 18 years. In John 5, healing the paralyzed man at the pool of Bethesda. In every single one of these instances, the Pharisees are standing right there, taking notes, practically salivating, just ready to prosecute.
Waiting for him to slip up.
Exactly. My question is, why were they so obsessed with stopping healing? I mean, on the surface, it seems cartoonishly evil to get mad at someone curing a paralyzed guy.
To understand their reaction, we have to look at the sociological function of the law for the Pharisees. For them, the rule had completely replaced the reason for the rule. The Sabbath was originally instituted in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, as a profound revolutionary gift. It was a mandated day of rest and liberation, meant to break the endless, crushing cycle of economic extraction that the Israelites had experienced as slaves in Egypt. It was designed to ensure human flourishing and dignity.
So it was basically an anti-burnout mandate from God.
Exactly. But over centuries, the Pharisees had layered the original command with the tradition of the elders, thousands of oral micro-laws detailing exactly what constituted work.
Like how many steps you could take.
Exactly. They turned a gift of liberation into a sprawling minefield of technicalities. And they used this minefield to police behavior, to evaluate social compliance, and to essentially maintain their own status as the ultimate gatekeepers of who was in and who was out.
So when Jesus encounters the man with the withered hand in Matthew 12, the Pharisees who ask him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? They aren't asking a genuine theological question. They aren't seeking wisdom.
No, not at all. The text explicitly says they watched him in order to accuse him. It is a legal trap dressed up as a theological inquiry. They effectively took a compassionate act of medical and spiritual restoration and turned it into a potential criminal charge.
That's just wild.
They were fully hoping that a suffering man's body would be the cheese in the mousetrap they set for Jesus.
That is just breathtakingly cynical. And it happens again in Luke 13 with the crippled woman. Jesus heals her, and the synagogue leader actually gets indignant. He stands up and tells the crowd, "There are 6 days for work, come be healed then, not on the Sabbath." As if she's just, running an errand to the grocery store.
And Jesus' response to the synagogue leader is blistering. He points out their profound hypocrisy. He notes that any of them will gladly untie their ox or their donkey on the Sabbath to lead it to water because it's their economic property and they don't want it to die. But they object to a daughter of Abraham, a human being untied from 18 years of physical bondage. They had completely inverted the very purpose of the law. They valued animal comfort and the preservation of their own wealth over human liberation.
Oh.
And Jesus' core argument against this entire system of weaponization is summarized perfectly in Mark 2.27. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath.
He refused to let the law be a legal weapon. He constantly, relentlessly emphasized mercy over technicality and human restoration over rigid ritual purity. We see it with the purity laws too, right?
Yeah.
Like in Mark 7 when they freak out about the disciples eating with unwashed hands.
Oh, exactly.
It wasn't about hedging. It was about maintaining a manufactured boundary of who is clean and who is dirty. But as manipulative as the Pharisees were, they were mostly trying to discredit Jesus to maintain their social standing and their religious monopoly.
Yes.
If we want to look at masterclasses in using the law for outright legal assassination and absolute destruction, we have to look at some darker narratives in our sources.
We do. If the Pharisees represent Scripture, weaponized through rigid, self-righteous over-application, Queen Jezebel in the Old Testament represents something much colder.
Much colder.
She represents Scripture's legal procedures weaponized with full, cynical knowledge of what they actually mean, deployed simply because they are effective tools for murder.
Let's talk about the story of Naboth's vineyard in 1 Kings 21. This story is just chilling. So King Ahab wants this beautiful vineyard next to his palace to plant a vegetable garden. He offers to buy it, but Naboth refuses. And legally, Naboth is entirely in the right, isn't he?
Completely in the right. Leviticus 25 establishes a very specific land theology. The land ultimately belongs in a deep covenantal sense to God, and it is given to families to remain in their lineage forever. It is an inheritance.
Right.
It wasn't Naboth's to sell just because a king had a whim. Naboth is obeying the Torah by refusing. So Ahab goes home, gets in bed, and literally sulks like a child. But Jezebel, his wife, sees an opportunity to assert absolute royal dominance.
Enter Jezebel.
Right. And what is so terrifying is that she doesn't use brute force. She has the royal guard. She could just send a thug to stab Naboth in an alley. But she doesn't. She outlawyers him.
She embodies this concept of lawful evil. It's terrifying. It's literally the bureaucracy of murder. Walk us through exactly how she does it.
Well, she weaponizes 3 specific, distinct aspects of Mosaic law to orchestrate a legal assassination. First, she utilizes the witness requirement. Deuteronomy 17 strictly requires 2 or 3 witnesses for a capital conviction, a rule originally designed to protect the innocent and prevent frame jobs.
Right, to stop false accusation.
Exactly. But Jezebel deliberately hires exactly 2 scoundrels to testify because she knows the procedure requires 2 to look legitimate. Second, she weaponizes the blasphemy statute from Leviticus, having these false witnesses claim Naboth cursed both God and the king.
Why blasphemy specifically?
She chooses blasphemy because it is the one charge severe enough to warrant immediate public execution by stoning, which also conveniently results in the forfeiture of the land to the crown.
And then there's the third element, which is just pure psychological warfare.
Yes, the communal fast. She orders the elders of the city to proclaim a fast and give Naboth a seat of honor. In the ancient Near East, a sudden public fast indicated that a grave sin had been committed and the community was in danger of divine wrath.
So she's setting the mood.
Exactly. By staging this, she manufactures a theater of collective dread. She makes the entire community believe a spiritual rot is among them, priming them to react violently when the accusation is finally dropped.
Every single step follows the outward form of a godly, righteous, legal process. That is the true horror of it. She inhabits the law like a costume.
Yes.
It reminds me of a burglar who, instead of smashing a window with a brick and setting off a blaring alarm, uses a highly sophisticated lockpick. From the outside, anyone watching just sees someone putting a key in a door.
Right, it looks normal.
The procedure looks entirely correct. No alarms go off. The community thinks justice is being served. She uses the exact mechanics of the law to absolutely gut its moral purpose. And honestly, she isn't the only one in Scripture who does this. We see Satan doing the exact same procedural mimicry in the wilderness.
Yes. During the temptation of Jesus in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, Satan doesn't rely on obvious, blatant lies. He relies on isolated truths.
Which is so much more dangerous.
He takes Jesus to the highest point of the temple and literally quotes Scripture at him. He quotes Psalm 91, which is a genuine, real promise of divine protection. He will command his angels concerning you, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone.
So he's using the Bible against Jesus.
Yes. Satan strips the verse of its context, which is about trusting God through hardship, and turns it into a dare to manufacture a cheap spectacle. He uses God's own word to try and goad Jesus into the sin of pride and testing God.
And how does Jesus respond? Does he say, well, Psalm 91 is a bad verse, let's ignore it?
No, he counters the isolated scripture with contextual scripture. He quotes Deuteronomy 6.16, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." He restores the theological balance. He refuses to let the verse be weaponized.
And we see this dark procedural mimicry continue right through the New Testament, especially with the mock trials of Jesus and Stephen.
Exactly. The Sanhedrin, during the trial of Jesus, actively looks for false evidence. They twist his metaphorical theological words about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days into a literal capital charge of terrorism and blasphemy.
They used his own words as a weapon.
And with Stephen, the first martyr in Acts 6, they again produce false witnesses who claim he blasphemed Moses and the customs. In both cases, the legal structure meant to discover truth and protect the innocent is hijacked to execute them. The law becomes an accelerant for injustice.
But, just to show how complex this all is, there is one story in our sources where gaming the rules actually produces a positive outcome. It's a bizarre twist, where procedural manipulation actually produces mercy and survival.
Oh, you're talking about the Gibeonite deception in Joshua 9. This is a fascinating counterexample.
That's such a great story.
It really is. So the Gibeonites are a Canaanite tribe, and they know that Israel, under Mosaic law, is commanded to annihilate the nearby Canaanite cities. However, the law in Deuteronomy 20 also requires Israel to offer peace treaties to distant foreign nations.
Okay, so they see a loophole.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the Gibeonites engage in an elaborate disguise. They wear worn-out, patched clothes, they put worn-out sandals on their feet, and they bring dry, moldy bread and cracked, mended wineskins. They present themselves to Joshua, acting like weary, exhausted travelers from a far-off land.
It's literally an ancient sting operation, and they successfully trick Joshua and the leaders into swearing an oath of peace before God.
They do. And the crucial point is that Joshua, bound by his scriptural obligation and his oath before God, honors the treaty even after he finds out 3 days later that they are neighbors living right down the road. The Gibeonites essentially use Israel's own strict scriptural rules to save themselves from destruction. It shows that the procedures of the text, the laws and oath, aren't inherently evil. It's the intent behind how they are used. The Gibeonites used the rules to survive. Jezebel used them to murder.
Which brings us to the most crucial and perhaps the most practical part of this entire analysis. Having seen the history, having traced the mechanics from ancient Israel to Roman slavery to the modern domestic living room, we have to look at the psychology.
Yeah, the human element.
Right. Why does this work so incredibly effectively on victims? Because from the outside, looking in, someone might look at a controlling husband or a corrupt pastor and think, well, why don't people just argue back? Why don't they just leave or point out the obvious hypocrisy?
It works because it bypasses normal human defenses through a psychological dynamic we can accurately call divine gaslighting.
Divine gaslighting.
Yes. Normal, secular coercive control requires the abuser to slowly build trust with the victim over time before they can exploit it. Scriptural manipulation skips that arduous step entirely because the manipulator simply borrows the immense trust, reverence, and fear that the victim has already invested in the sacred text.
So they don't have to build the trust, they just hijack it.
Exactly. The manipulator seamlessly aligns their own personal will with the voice of God. They shift the conflict from a horizontal plane, which is human versus human, to a vertical plane, which is human versus God.
So when a husband quotes Ephesians 5.22 to demand absolute financial control or to dictate what his wife wears, he's not just saying, I want to be in charge because I like power. He's saying, God, the creator of the universe, commands that I am in charge, and if you resist me, you aren't just disagreeing with your husband, you are actively rebelling against the Almighty.
And the psychological weight of that on a devout person is just crushing.
I can't even imagine.
It is entirely paralyzing. It creates what psychologists call a double bind, which rapidly leads to learned helplessness. The victim is trapped in a maze with no exits. Disagreeing with the abusive interpretation feels indistinguishable from disagreeing with God himself.
Wow.
This triggers intense guilt, profound fear of divine punishment, and just crippling self-doubt. Because the victim's own moral compass is deeply tied to the authority of the text, invoking the text against them effectively disables their internal defense mechanisms. Their own faith is weaponized against their instinct for self-preservation.
And the emotional toll this takes, I mean, our sources go into devastating detail about how normal, healthy human reactions to being abused are systematically pathologized.
Oh, absolutely.
If a victim feels angry about being exploited or feels deep grief over losing their autonomy and their identity, the manipulative system labels those completely normal, God-given emotions as sins. You know, you have a root of bitterness, you have a rebellious spirit, you aren't trusting God's design.
Yes, the emotional register of the victim is deeply, perhaps permanently, damaged. It replaces the warmth of intimacy and trust with the coldness of surveillance and obligation. And the theological dimension of this trauma is perhaps the most tragic of all.
How do you mean?
The very image of God in the victim's mind is altered. God is no longer seen as the compassionate, self-emptying figure of love we see in the kenosis of Christ. Instead, God is recast as a severe, demanding, emotionally volatile monarch who mirrors the exact toxic traits of the human abuser.
So God just becomes a bigger version of their abuser.
Exactly. Grace is entirely eliminated from the equation. The victim is left emotionally exhausted, constantly suppressing their own survival instincts to meet artificial, impossible standards imposed by a system that has weaponized the divine against them.
Okay, let's take a breath and unpack everything we've journeyed through today, because this has been a lot.
It's heavy. It's really heavy.
We've seen that Scripture is a profoundly powerful architectural tool. It builds worldviews. It shapes civilizations. But when truth is divorced from love, it rapidly becomes cruelty. When we strip context away, we don't build homes, we build prisons.
Well said.
We saw how wives submit is surgically amputated from the beautiful, radical call for mutual submission and Christ-like self-emptying. We saw how obey your leaders is severed from the mandate of accountable, sleepless care for the vulnerable flock.
And we've seen how the mechanics of the law were cynically weaponized by the Pharisees to stop healing, by Queen Jezebel to steal land and commit murder, and by historical slaveholders to justify the indefensible. It almost always flows downhill to crush the vulnerable.
Right.
But we've also seen the massive, undeniable counterweight. When the context is fully restored, the picture changes entirely. We find mutual submission, accountable leadership, radical economic justice and equality, and a God who doesn't dominate, but who empties himself for others. Yep. A healthy biblical faith like that of the Bereans in the book of Acts, who are praised for their nobility. It doesn't demand blind, fearful, unquestioning acceptance. It actively encourages rigorous questioning, critical thinking, and searching the scriptures to verify what is actually true.
It's about reading the whole room, not just staring at the one brick someone decided to throw at your head.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. It is heavy material, but it is so necessary to understand the deep mechanics of these dynamics so we can spot them before the trap closes.
Absolutely.
Now, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Think back to that moment we discussed. When Jesus was tempted by Satan in the wilderness, Jesus was starving. He was physically exhausted. He was completely isolated. He was facing the ultimate psychological manipulator who was literally quoting scripture right at him. Jesus didn't respond by throwing the scriptures away. He didn't say, well, the text is broken, let's abandon it. He responded by quoting more of it. He demanded the full context. He answered an isolated, weaponized verse with a fully contextualized truth. So if the ultimate antidote to weaponized truth isn't abandoning the truth, but actually seeking more of it, how might you look differently at the next absolute rule someone tries to hand you?